Sign the termination papers, Richard. You're out. Julian sneered, sliding the document across the boardroom table. I didn't argue. I just smiled, signed it, and walked out. Because the moment the ink dried, his $120 million takeover was already dead. It was 2026, and I was 52 years old. For the past 2 decades, I had been the chief strategy officer and head of mergers and acquisitions at Vanguard Operations, a specialized logistics and supply chain management firm. When the original founder, Old Man Henry, brought me on 20 years ago, we were barely doing $5 million in annual recurring revenue. Through a series of aggressive acquisitions, precise integrations, and relentless optimization, we scaled this beast to a valuation of over $120 million. We weren't just a company. We were the backbone of regional freight and warehousing for 3 major metropolitan hubs. I knew every contract, every lease, every equity structure, and every hidden skeleton in Vanguard's corporate closet. I built the closet. My days usually started at 6 in the morning, reviewing overnight freight manifests and international port clearances before stepping into the executive suite. The smell of stale coffee and the hum of server racks processing our proprietary logistics software were my comfort zones. I wasn't a flashy executive. I didn't care about corner offices with panoramic views or custom-tailored Italian suits, though I wore a decent navy blue one when the situation demanded it. I cared about stability, sustainable growth, and the structural integrity of the enterprise we had meticulously constructed. But stability is boring to the young and ambitious. Enter Julian Vance. Julian was 30 years old, possessing an MBA from a school he loved to mention and a dangerous mix of unearned confidence and financial illiteracy. He wasn't entirely unqualified on paper, but his experience was limited to theoretical case studies and short-term private equity gigs, where the goal was always to gut a company, dress up the balance sheet, and flip it to the highest bidder within 36 months. When Henry's health began to decline a year ago, the board, dominated by newer, aggressive institutional investors who had bought out some of the early partners, pushed Julian into the CEO seat. They wanted a young, dynamic visionary. They got a shark with no teeth but a very loud bark. From the day Julian took the corner office, our philosophies clashed. Vanguard Operations was built on long-term client relationships and ironclad service-level agreements. We owned our own warehouses and held long-term leases on strategic cross-docking facilities. Our EBITDA margins were a healthy 18%, which was phenomenal for our industry. But Julian didn't care about operations. He cared about multiples. He wanted to strip down our assets, sell off the real estate, lease it back at exorbitant rates, and dump the heavily leveraged shell of the company onto a larger conglomerate. His ultimate goal was a quick acquisition by Apex Global, a massive multinational logistics player looking to expand into our territory. Apex was offering a straight cash buyout of $120 million. If the deal went through, Julian's golden parachute and equity kickers would net him a cool $12 million personally. It was the quintessential corporate hit and run. I opposed him at every turn. As the chief strategy officer, I sat on the board and held a significant minority stake. About 12% of the voting shares. Sarah Jenkins, our chief financial officer and my most trusted ally in the executive team, held another 5%. Together with a few loyalists, we had enough voting power to make any hostile moves difficult, but not impossible. Sarah was a razor-sharp 45-year-old financial architect who understood the underlying mechanics of our business just as well as I did. We spent countless late nights over cold takeout, auditing Julian's disastrous proposals and finding ways to block them in committee. He's going to try to force the Apex deal before the end of the fiscal year. Richard, Sarah had warned me one Tuesday evening, her eyes scanning a spreadsheet of proposed asset liquidations. He's already shopping our prime warehousing space in Sector 4 to private equity buyers. If he signs those sale-leaseback agreements, our operational costs will spike by 30%. We'll be bleeding cash. He needs board approval for any asset sale exceeding $5 million, I reminded her, leaning back in my chair. And he knows I'll veto it. The Apex deal only works if we have those warehouses on our balance sheet. That's exactly why he needs you gone, Sarah replied, looking up from her screen. You're the only immovable object in his way. He's been holding closed-door meetings with the institutional investors. They want the Apex payout just as badly as he does. They're going to try to push you out. I had anticipated this. In the corporate world, loyalty is a depreciating asset. I knew Julian was maneuvering to terminate me, and I had spent the last 3 months preparing for the inevitable. What Julian and the new board members didn't understand was that Vanguard Operations was protected by a labyrinth of legal and structural fail-safes that I had designed a decade ago to prevent exactly this kind of predatory asset stripping. When Henry and I renegotiated my executive contract 5 years ago, I insisted on a very specific, highly customized severance package. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. Hidden deep within Section 8 of my employment agreement, buried under standard non-compete clauses and confidentiality agreements, was a structural provision tied directly to the company's capitalization table. We called it the poison pill. The clause was simple but devastating. If my employment was terminated without cause, or if my role was significantly diminished, within 12 months of any active merger or acquisition negotiations, my unvested equity options would immediately accelerate. But they wouldn't just vest as standard common stock. They would automatically convert into Class B supervoting shares, granting me 10 votes per share instead of the standard one. It was a defensive mechanism designed to prevent hostile takeovers and ensure that the founding team maintained control during critical transitions. Henry understood its purpose, and we had the company's external counsel draft it quietly. Julian, in his haste to take over the company and push his agenda, had never bothered to read the historical employment contracts of the legacy executive team. He relied on summaries provided by his equally inexperienced legal advisors, who only checked for standard severance payouts. They thought firing me would just cost them 12 months of my base salary, about $360,000. A rounding error in a $120 million acquisition. They didn't realize it would cost them the entire company. The tension in the office grew thicker with each passing week. Julian began isolating me from key operational meetings. He revoked my access to the Apex negotiation data room, claiming it was a conflict of interest since I had openly opposed the deal. He started bringing in expensive external consultants to audit my department, desperately searching for a justifiable reason to terminate me with cause to avoid paying my severance. But my department was spotless. Our M&A integrations were flawless, our compliance records were pristine, and our departmental budget was under target by 4%. There was no cause. If he wanted me out, he would have to do it the hard way, and I was more than ready for him to try. The board meeting was scheduled for the end of the month, and I knew the guillotine was waiting. I spent my mornings ensuring our operational metrics were locked down, and my evenings reviewing SEC Rule 14d-10 regarding tender offers, making sure my defensive strategy was airtight. Julian thought he was playing a game of checkers, jumping pieces to reach the end of the board. He had no idea I had rigged the entire table to collapse the moment he crowned as king. The trap was meticulously set. All I needed was for him to step on the trigger. The final week of November arrived with a chilling frost, both outside the glass walls of our corporate headquarters and within the executive suite. Julian's impatience had reached a boiling point. The Apex Global acquisition was reportedly in its final due diligence phase, but Apex's legal team was demanding unanimous board approval before they would sign the binding letter of intent. They didn't want any post-acquisition litigation from dissenting minority shareholders. Julian needed my vote, and since he knew he couldn't buy it or persuade me, he had to eliminate my seat at the table entirely. The monthly board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. I walked into the main conference room precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying only a single leather portfolio. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by 3 new board members representing the institutional investors. Sarah Jenkins was already seated, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. She gave me a subtle nod as I took my usual seat opposite Julian. "Let's get straight to it," Julian began, not bothering with the usual formalities or reviewing the operational minutes. "We are in the final stages of the Apex transaction. The valuation is locked at $120 million. This is a historic exit for Vanguard operations, and it's time we move forward to a formal shareholder vote. We've discussed this, Julian, I said, my voice steady and measured. The Apex deal severely undervalues our physical assets. If we execute the sale-leaseback structure you're proposing, just to inflate the short-term cash payout, the operational burden will bankrupt the core business within 24 months. You're selling the foundation to paint the roof. Julian's jaw tightened. The core business will be Apex's problem after the transition. Our fiduciary duty is to maximize immediate shareholder value. The institutional investors agree. The market is cooling, and we need to liquidate now. My fiduciary duty is to the long-term viability of the enterprise and all its stakeholders. Not just your transition bonus, I countered, leaning forward slightly. And as long as I hold 12% of the voting shares and sit on this board, I will not authorize a unanimous consent resolution for this acquisition. The room fell dead silent. One of the institutional directors, a man in his late 40s with a slick-back haircut, cleared his throat. Richard, your dedication to the operational side of the business is appreciated, but your strategy is outdated. We need alignment in the executive team to close this deal. Julian stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at me with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. Alignment is exactly what we are going to achieve today. Richard, your refusal to cooperate with the strategic direction of this company constitutes a fundamental breach of your executive duties. You've become a bottleneck to our growth and a liability to our shareholders. He slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood of the conference table. It stopped precisely in front of my portfolio. This is your formal notice of termination. Effective immediately, Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. The board has convened a special session prior to this meeting and voted to remove you from the position of Chief Strategy Officer. Consequently, per the corporate bylaws, your seat on the board of directors is also revoked. Sarah stiffened in her chair, though she knew this was coming. On what grounds, Julian? Richard's performance metrics are flawless. You can't just terminate an executive officer of 20 years without cause simply because he disagrees with a disastrous M&A strategy. Oh, it's without cause, Julian smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. We aren't claiming malfeasance. We are simply exercising our right to terminate his at-will employment agreement. We will, of course, honor the standard severance payout of 12 months' base salary. $360,000. Consider it a very generous retirement gift, Richard. You've earned a rest. He was so incredibly confident, so thoroughly convinced of his own brilliance. He had calculated the cost of removing me and decided it was a small price to pay to clear the path for his $12 million payday. He thought he had navigated the corporate chessboard perfectly. I looked at the folder, then up at Julian. Effective immediately? I asked softly. Immediately, Julian confirmed, crossing his arms. Security has already been instructed to disable your keycard and network access. IT is remotely wiping your company devices as we speak. You have exactly 30 minutes to clear any personal items from your office under the supervision of human resources. You are no longer authorized to speak on behalf of Vanguard operations, nor are you permitted to contact any of our clients or vendors. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to yell, to threaten lawsuits, to beg for my position, or to make a scene in front of the board. He wanted to feel the power of breaking a legacy executive. Instead, I calmly opened the folder, retrieved a silver fountain pen from my inside pocket, and flipped to the signature page of the termination acknowledgement. I didn't even bother reading the restrictive covenants or the non-disparagement clauses. They were irrelevant now. Understood, I said quietly. I signed my name with deliberate, even strokes, capped my pen, and closed the folder, sliding it back across the table toward him. Julian looked momentarily confused by my lack of resistance, but his arrogance quickly masked it. Make sure you leave the corporate credit cards on your desk, he sneered. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket, and picked up my leather portfolio. I looked at Sarah, offering her a brief, reassuring glance. She knew the plan. Her job now was to stay inside and monitor the fallout. I looked at the institutional board members, who were already checking their phones, entirely dismissive of the 20 years of my life they had just casually discarded. Finally, I looked at Julian. Good luck with the Apex acquisition, Julian. I sincerely hope you've read all the corporate bylaws and legacy contracts carefully. The details in M&A can be quite unforgiving. Julian laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. I think we'll manage just fine without your outdated strategies, Richard. Goodbye. I walked out of the conference room without another word. The walk down the hallway to my office felt remarkably peaceful. I wasn't angry. I was incredibly focused. An HR representative, looking highly uncomfortable, was waiting for me outside my door. I packed my few personal belongings, a framed photo of my late wife, a vintage brass compass Henry had given me on my 10th anniversary with the company, and a few specialized industry textbooks. It took less than 15 minutes. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, my personal phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an automated alert from my private legal counsel's monitoring software. The termination paperwork had been formally filed with the company's internal HR system. Officially stamping the time of my dismissal, the trigger had been pulled. The condition of termination without cause within 12 months of active M&A negotiations was now an indisputable, documented fact. Julian had just fired the opening shot of a war he didn't even know he was fighting, and he had handed me the nuclear launch codes in the process. I stepped out of the glass doors of the Vanguard Operations building into the crisp November air, feeling a profound sense of anticipation. The countdown had begun, and the devastation was going to be absolute. I didn't go home after leaving the Vanguard Operations building. I drove straight to the downtown offices of Harrison and Sterling, the boutique corporate law firm that had quietly drafted my revised executive contract 5 years ago. They didn't represent Vanguard. They represented me, personally. I had kept them on retainer for exactly this scenario. I walked into the corner office of my lead attorney, a meticulous 50-year-old corporate litigator named Robert. Though he preferred Rob, he was already reviewing the digital copies of the termination notice I had forwarded from my personal phone the moment I stepped out of the elevator. "Well, Richard, they actually did it," Rob said, looking up over his reading glasses as I took a seat across from his massive oak desk. "Termination without cause, effective immediately, citing a fundamental disagreement over strategic direction. It's a textbook execution." "They were in a hurry," I replied, setting my leather portfolio on the floor. Julian needs the board unanimously aligned to finalize the Apex Global acquisition. He thought firing me was the quickest way to remove the roadblock. Rob chuckled dryly, tapping his pen against a printed copy of my original employment agreement. And in doing so, he just drove his sports car straight off a cliff. "Have you reviewed the exact wording of Section 8 recently?" "I know it by heart," I said. Section 8, subsection C, was the poison pill. It was a brilliantly complex piece of corporate defensive structuring. It stipulated that if I were terminated without cause while the company was actively engaged in merger or acquisition talks, my remaining unvested stock options, representing about 8% of the total outstanding equity, would immediately accelerate and vest. But the genius of the clause wasn't just the acceleration, it was the conversion. Those options wouldn't vest as standard Class A common stock. Due to a specific Founders Cup protection designation we had buried in the original corporate charter years ago, my options were legally tied to a unique class of preferred shares. Upon a hostile termination trigger, they automatically converted into Class B super voting shares. Each Class B share carried 10 times the voting weight of a standard Class A share. "Let's run the math for the official record," Rob said, pulling up a spreadsheet on his monitor. "Before today, you held 12% of the voting power. Julian and his institutional backers held roughly 60%. They had control. But with the activation of Section 8, your accelerated 8% equity converts at a 10-to-1 voting ratio. In terms of raw voting power, you are suddenly holding the equivalent of 80% of the voting bloc. By executing this termination, Julian has mathematically diluted the voting power of every other shareholder, including himself, down to a minority fraction, effectively giving me unilateral control over any major corporate action, including the approval or rejection of an acquisition I confirmed. And since the company's bylaws require a supermajority shareholder vote, 75%, to approve a buyout of this magnitude, The Apex deal is completely dead in the water without my explicit authorization. Not just dead, Rob corrected, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a legal checkmate. It's radioactive. The moment we file the conversion notice with the State Regulatory Board and the SEC, Vanguard's capitalization table will instantly rewrite itself. Julian's personal equity, which he was counting on cashing out for $12 million, will be diluted in voting power so severely that it becomes virtually worthless in a hostile buyout scenario. He won't be able to force a sale, and he won't be able to control the board. I leaned back in my chair, visualizing the chain reaction I was about to unleash. How fast can we execute the conversion? The paperwork is already drafted, Richard. We've had it ready for 3 months, Rob said, opening a heavy file folder on his desk and sliding several thick documents toward me. I just need your signature on the formal exercise notice and the SEC Schedule 13D filing declaring your new controlling interest. Once you sign these, I will courier them directly to the state corporate registry and electronically file them with the SEC. By Monday morning at 9 a.m., the new cap table will be a matter of public legal record. I picked up the pen from Rob's desk. It felt heavier than the one I had used to sign my termination papers just 2 hours ago. That signature had been a quiet surrender. This one was an absolute declaration of corporate war. I signed the documents methodically, initialing every required page, ensuring every legal requirement was perfectly met. Done, I said, handing the stack back to him. I'll have my paralegals process this immediately, Rob said, gathering the papers. Now, we need to talk about the notification strategy. When do you want to drop the bomb on Julian? I don't, I smiled, a cold, calculated expression. I want Sarah to handle the internal communications. She's still inside. I want Julian to find out not from a dramatic phone call from me, but from the cold, undeniable reality of a legal filing crashing into his inbox on a Monday morning, just as he's preparing to sign the final paperwork with Apex Global. Over the weekend, I completely disconnected. I didn't check my email, I didn't answer unknown calls, and I took long walks in the crisp autumn air. I knew the storm was brewing in the silent digital corridors of legal registries and corporate databases. But for those 48 hours, I simply enjoyed the profound peace of a perfectly executed strategy. Meanwhile, Sarah was working quietly on the inside. She had access to the company's master cap table software. Late Sunday night, she received the automated legal notification from the state registry confirming the processing of my Class B share conversion. She spent hours meticulously updating the internal equity tracking system to reflect the new reality. She didn't alert Julian or the board. She simply let the system update passively, knowing that Julian's lawyers would run a final compliance check first thing Monday morning before the Apex signing ceremony. The trap was fully armed, the bait had been taken, and the mechanism had triggered flawlessly. Julian had fired me to clear the path for a $120 million payday, entirely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed me the keys to the entire kingdom. The clock was ticking toward Monday morning, and the financial devastation that awaited him was going to be biblical. Monday morning arrived with the clinical precision of an execution schedule. At 8:45 a.m., I was sitting in my home study, a cup of freshly brewed black coffee steaming on my desk, watching the financial news networks on mute. The market was calm, unaware of the corporate tectonic plates shifting just beneath the surface of Vanguard operations. At exactly 9, the Apex Global executive team was scheduled to arrive at Vanguard's headquarters to sign the final binding letter of intent and publicly announce the $120 million acquisition. Julian had undoubtedly spent the weekend polishing his victory speech, already mentally spending his $12 million payout. But at 8:55 a.m., the corporate reality he thought he controlled violently shattered. According to Sarah, who texted me real-time updates from her office, down the hall from the executive suite, the implosion started in the legal department. Julian's external M&A counsel had logged into the company's digital data room to run a final, standard compliance check on the capitalization table, a routine procedure required by Apex Global before any ink touched paper. When the lawyer refreshed the cap table, the software didn't show the expected 60% majority control held by Julian and the institutional investors. Instead, the system flagged a massive, unauthorized dilution warning. The lawyer stared at the screen, assuming a software glitch, and manually pulled the latest SEC Schedule 13D filings from the state registry. The documents were there, officially stamped, legally binding, and completely irrefutable. Richard Mercer, the executive terminated without cause just 4 days prior, had executed Section 8 of his employment agreement. The 8% of unvested options had converted into Class B supervoting shares. The lawyer sprinted down the hallway to Julian's corner office, bypassing the executive assistant and throwing the door open. Sarah watched from the glass walls of her office as the color completely drained from Julian's face as the lawyer slammed the printed cap table onto his desk. "What is this?" Julian's voice had reportedly cracked, echoing through the thin walls of the executive suite. "What do you mean he has 80% voting control? We fired him. We bought him out. You terminated him without cause during an active M&A window," the lawyer yelled back, panicked about his own firm's liability for missing the clause. It triggered a poison pill in his legacy contract. His options accelerated and converted to supervoting shares. Julian, he doesn't just have a seat at the table anymore. He owns the table. He has enough voting power to single-handedly block the Apex acquisition. The deal is dead. At 9:02 a.m., my personal phone began to ring. It was an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring out to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again, and then again. By 9:15 a.m., I had 14 missed calls from Julian, 3 from the institutional board members, and a frantic email from Julian's lead counsel demanding an immediate good-faith negotiation. I finally picked up on the 15th call. I didn't say hello. I just let the silence hang on the line. "Richard," Julian's voice was ragged, stripped of all the smug arrogance he had paraded on Thursday. He sounded like a man who had just watched his house burn down. "Richard, what did you do? What is this Class B conversion nonsense?" "It's not nonsense, Julian," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "It's corporate law. Specifically, it's Section 8 of the contract you were too arrogant to read before you tried to execute a hostile termination. You fired me to clear a roadblock. You ended up handing me the detonator. You can't do this," Julian shouted, his panic escalating into genuine desperation. "The Apex team is in the lobby. We are signing the paperwork in 20 minutes. If you block this deal, the institutional investors will sue you into oblivion for breaching your fiduciary duty." "My fiduciary duty is to protect the long-term value of the company," I corrected him calmly. "A duty I am currently fulfilling by blocking a predatory sale-leaseback scheme that would bankrupt the operational core within 2 years. And as for lawsuits, good luck finding a judge who will penalize a majority shareholder for exercising a legally binding, board-approved contractual clause that you willingly triggered. You didn't do your due diligence, Julian. That's not a lawsuit. That's incompetence." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I could hear his rapid breathing. He was finally realizing the absolute totality of his defeat. He hadn't just lost the Apex deal. He had lost control of the company. With his equity heavily diluted in voting power, his $12 million payout had vanished into thin air. He was a CEO in name only, reporting to a board that I now functionally controlled. "What do you want, Richard?" Julian finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. The fight was completely gone. "I want the Apex deal officially canceled. Today," I dictated, my tone cold and unyielding. "I want a formal press release drafted citing unfavorable market conditions for the withdrawal. Then, I want you to convene an emergency board meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. You are going to tender your resignation as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, and you are going to forfeit your severance package in exchange for the company not pursuing legal action against you for gross negligence regarding the M&A due diligence. You want me to resign and walk away with nothing?" Julian gasped. "After everything I've done? You tried to sell the foundation of a 20-year-old company for a quick bonus, and you fired me to do it," I said, my voice hardening. "You're not walking away with nothing, Julian. You're walking away with a very expensive lesson in corporate strategy. You have until 9:30 a.m. to cancel the Apex meeting and send them home. If you don't, I will personally call the Apex CEO and inform him that Vanguard Operations is currently experiencing a hostile internal takeover and is no longer legally authorized to sign binding agreements. It will be the most embarrassing moment of your professional career." I didn't wait for his response. I hung up the phone and set it face down on my desk. The chaos was unfolding exactly as I had modeled it. Julian was trapped in a financial and legal checkmate with nowhere left to run. At 9:28 a.m., 2 minutes before my deadline, my phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was a forward from Julian, sent to the entire executive team and the board of directors. The subject line read, "Urgent, suspension of Apex Global Acquisition." The body of the email was brief, citing unexpected internal compliance reviews that necessitated an immediate halt to all negotiations. The Apex executive team, who had been sitting in the lobby drinking our premium coffee, were unceremoniously escorted out of the building. The $120 million deal was officially dead. The fallout was spectacular. The institutional investors, realizing they had backed a CEO who had catastrophically mismanaged the executive transition and lost their massive exit multiplier, turned on Julian instantly. The emergency board meeting I demanded for Tuesday morning wasn't a negotiation, it was an execution. I walked into the same conference room where I had been fired just 5 days earlier. This time I didn't sit opposite Julian. I sat at the head of the table. Sarah sat to my right, her laptop open, already running the revised operational projections for the quarter. The 3 institutional board members looked pale and exhausted. Julian looked like a ghost. The board acknowledges the receipt of Julian Vance's resignation from the position of Chief Executive Officer. The slick-haired institutional director read from a prepared statement, avoiding eye contact with me. We also acknowledge the forfeiture of his executive severance package, as negotiated in lieu of potential litigation regarding the mishandling of the Apex Global due diligence process. Julian sat in silence, staring blankly at the mahogany table. He had tried to play corporate chess with a man who had built the board. He had gambled his $12 million payout on a hostile termination and lost everything. He stood up slowly, didn't look at anyone, and walked out of the room. There was no security escort this time. There was just the profound silence of complete defeat. "Now," I said, leaning forward and folding my hands on the table, instantly shifting the atmosphere in the room. "Let's talk about the future of Vanguard Operations. The immediate priority is stabilizing our operational core and repairing any damage done to our long-term client relationships over the past 6 months. We are not selling the Sector 4 warehouses. We are going to leverage their equity to secure a low-interest line of credit and upgrade our proprietary logistics software." The board members nodded in unison. They didn't have a choice. With my Class B supervoting shares, I held functional control over every strategic decision the company made. I wasn't just a board member anymore. I was the architect of Vanguard's future. "Furthermore," I continued, looking at Sarah, "I formally propose the appointment of Sarah Jenkins as the new Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Operations, effective immediately. She understands the operational mechanics, she respects the legacy of this firm, and she has the financial acumen to guide us through this transition." Sarah looked up, a rare, genuine smile breaking through her professional facade. The board, eager to appease the new majority shareholder and desperate for stability, voted unanimously to approve her appointment. I retained my position as Chief Strategy Officer and Chairman of the board. We had completely sterilized the executive suite, removing the parasitic elements and restoring the company to its foundational principles. Over the next 6 months, the transformation was remarkable. Under Sarah's leadership, we abandoned the aggressive, short-term M&A strategy that Julian had championed. Instead, we focused on organic growth, optimizing our existing supply chain networks, and deepening our relationships with key regional clients. Our EBITDA margins recovered quickly, stabilizing at a robust 20%. The institutional investors, initially furious about losing the quick Apex payout, eventually recognized the long-term sustainable value we were building. They stopped pushing for an immediate exit and started supporting our operational investments. As for Julian, his reputation in the corporate world took a massive hit. The details of his disastrous tenure at Vanguard Operations and his catastrophic failure to identify the poison pill in my contract quickly circulated through the private equity networks. He became a cautionary tale, a textbook example of an arrogant young executive who focused entirely on financial engineering and ignored the complex legal realities of executive compensation. He struggled to find another CEO position, eventually settling for a mid-level consultancy role at a firm known for handling distressed assets. It was a fitting, quiet end to his aggressive ambitions. A year after the boardroom coup, I was sitting in my office on a Friday afternoon. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting long golden shadows across the glass walls of the executive suite. I had my vintage brass compass sitting on my desk, a silent reminder of the journey. We had just closed a major, long-term logistics contract with a national retail chain, securing Vanguard's revenue projections for the next 5 years. The company was stronger, leaner, and more resilient than it had ever been. We hadn't needed a $120 million buyout to prove our value. We just needed to protect the foundation we had built. I looked at the framed photo of my late wife, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I had spent 2 decades building Vanguard Operations, and when an arrogant interloper tried to tear it apart for a quick profit, I hadn't just defended it. I had secured its future. The corporate world is often described as a ruthless game of survival where the most aggressive players take the biggest prizes. But aggression without strategy is just noise. True power doesn't come from corner offices or loud declarations in boardrooms. It comes from knowing the rules better than anyone else at the table, understanding the structural mechanics of the game, and having the patience to wait for your opponent to make a fatal mistake. Julian thought he was the shark circling the aging executive, ready to strike. He never realized that he was just swimming in my tank. And in my tank, I controlled the water. I packed my leather portfolio, turned off the lights in my office, and took the elevator down to the lobby. The weekend was waiting, and for the first time in a very long time, I had absolutely nothing to worry about. The strategy was complete, the board was secured, and the company was safe. The poison pill had done its job perfectly.